The strongest colony in your apiary right now probably won't fill a single super this June, not because the bees aren't there, not because the forage fails, not because the weather turns at the wrong week. The bees will be there, the clover will open, and the supers will still be light at the end of the season. Most beekeepers who see that outcome reach for an explanation that feels true because it's partially true. The season was off, the flow came late. Something with the weather. These explanations are comfortable because they point at something outside the hive, something that couldn't have been managed differently. But in the same county, on the same forage, in the same season, some colonies fill their supers and some don't. That gap is not random. It was documented precisely in commercial apiaries across Ohio and Indiana in the early 1920s by beekeepers who kept records detailed enough to separate the variable of management from the variable of weather. What they found wasn't luck. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't location. It was a single management decision made 6 weeks before the primary nectar flow. A decision most modern beekeepers never make because most modern beekeeping advice never tells them it needs to be made. There's a window in early May. 3 days wide, roughly. Miss it, and the strongest colony in your apiary will spend June producing bees instead of honey. Hit it, and that same colony enters the flow with the right bees at the right age, doing the right work at the exact moment the nectar is there to collect. The 1923 Ohio beekeepers knew how to find that window. They knew what to look for inside the hive 6 weeks before the flow, and they knew what to do when they found it. That knowledge is what this is about. If the kind of biology that explains why good colonies underperform is useful to you, a like on this video helps it reach other serious beekeepers. And if you've ended a season with lighter boxes than a colony that Strong should have produced, leave that in the comments. You're not alone in that experience. Now, to understand what the 1923 method actually corrected, you have to start with a question most beekeeping advice never asks. Not what does this colony look like today, but what will this colony's forager population look like on the day the primary nectar flow peaks? Those are different questions. The first one describes the colony's current state. The second one describes its projected demographic state 6 weeks from now. And the answer to the second question is the one that determines what ends up in the honey house. Here's where the biology turns against intuition, and where most modern advice quietly gets something wrong. The instinctive answer to honey production is population. More bees, more honey. Bigger colony, bigger harvest. That answer isn't wrong exactly. It's wrong in a specific and consequential way. Total population does not determine surplus production. What determines it is the ratio of foragers to non-foragers at the precise moment the nectar flow peaks. A colony of 60,000 bees where 40,000 of them are nurse bees tending brood will produce less surplus honey than a colony of 45,000 bees where 30,000 of them are active foragers. The arithmetic isn't about total numbers, it's about demographic composition at the critical window. And that composition is not fixed by genetics. It's not fixed by the strength of the colony. It's determined by timing, by decisions made or not made 6 weeks before the flow begins. A worker bee does not forage from the moment she emerges from her cell. For the first 21 days of her adult life, she performs internal hive work. She cleans cells, she feeds larvae, she processes incoming nectar and builds comb. She generates heat in the brood nest. She's a nurse bee, a house bee, a processor. She is biologically incapable of efficient foraging during this phase. Her hypopharyngeal glands are active, her flight muscles are not yet conditioned for extended foraging flight, and her behavioral programming keeps her inside the hive, responding to brood pheromone and recruitment signals from within the cluster. Only after those 21 days does she transition. Her glands regress, her flight muscles strengthen, she begins orientation flights, learns the landscape, and then for the remaining 2 to 4 weeks of her life, she becomes the engine of surplus honey production. She is a forager, and in the peak weeks of her foraging life, in that first 2 weeks after transition, she is at maximum efficiency. Older foragers are still functional, but their output is declining. The youngest foragers, the ones that just completed the nurse phase, are doing the most productive work. This is the biological clock that makes timing everything. And it is the clock the 1923 beekeepers learned to read and to manipulate with precision. A colony inspected in mid-April that shows wall-to-wall brood across 8 frames looks strong. It looks productive. It looks like it's positioned to perform. And the beekeeper who sees that colony goes home satisfied. But that inspection answered the wrong question. Very heavy of. If the primary clover flow in that region arrives in the 3rd week of June, which it did, consistently, across the Ohio and Indiana clover belt in the 1920s, and still does across much of the same region today, then the bees being raised from eggs in mid-April will not be contributing to surplus honey production for approximately 6 weeks. They emerge in 5 weeks. They spend 3 weeks as nurse bees. They begin foraging in roughly week 8 from now. If the flow peaks in week 6, those bees arrive after the window closes. They will forage, but they'll be foraging into a declining flow, building autumn stores rather than producing extractable surplus. The colony that looks strongest in April ends the season with lighter boxes than expected, and the beekeeper reaches for the weather explanation. The 1923 beekeeper stopped reaching for that explanation. They started reading the brood nest as a population projection. Not what does this colony look like today, but what will its forager cohort look like on the day the clover peaks? That question, asked in early May, is still the question that determines the weight of the honey house in late June. Now here's where it gets precise. And here's where the biology of the brood nest does something that almost nobody talks about in modern spring management advice. By early May, in a colony that has been building since February, the brood nest has frequently undergone a structural transformation that most beekeepers walk right past. Not because they're inattentive, because they're looking at the right frames and asking the wrong question. The queen began the season in a small cluster with open drawn comb available in every direction. She expanded her laying pattern outward, frame by frame, as the population grew. The colony looked like it was performing exactly as it should, and it was. But as the season progressed, 2 things were happening simultaneously, and together they were creating a constraint that would cost the beekeeper the season. Foragers were returning with increasing volumes of nectar and pollen as spring advanced, and the colony was storing that incoming material in the first available cells, which were frequently the cells immediately surrounding and above the brood nest. The frames that had previously been open laying space were being reclaimed. Capped honey was pressing down from above. Pollen and incoming nectar were packing into the cells at the brood nest edges. The queen's available laying space was contracting, even as the colony's population was at or near its peak. She wasn't failing. She wasn't old. Her genetics hadn't changed. She was spatially constrained. Moving through the brood nest, laying in every open cell she could find. But the open cells were fewer and less accessible than they had been 6 weeks earlier. Her daily egg output dropped, not because of her biology, because of the architecture of the hive around her. This is the condition the 1923 method was designed to correct. Not a failing queen, a structurally imprisoned one. Same apiary, same forage, same weather. One beekeeper sees a strong colony and goes home. Another beekeeper sees a queen whose laying rate has been quietly cut by the architecture surrounding her and knows exactly what to do about it. The difference between those 2 beekeepers showed up in the honey house. The intervention itself was structurally simple. It required no purchased input, no replacement queen, no commercial stock. It required drawn comb, a hive tool, and a precise understanding of what was happening and when. Working within the window of 5 to 6 weeks before the anticipated flow peak, for the Ohio and Indiana clover belt, this placed the intervention in early to mid-May. The beekeeper opened the brood nest and made two targeted adjustments. The first was the removal of frames that had been reclaimed from brood use by incoming honey and pollen. These frames, typically sitting at the edges of the brood nest, showing mixed brood and capped storage, were moved to the outer positions of the brood box, not removed from the hive, moved to the edges where they'd continue to be managed by the colony, but would no longer compress the queen's central laying zone. In their place, 2 to 3 frames of drawn empty comb were inserted directly into the centre of the brood nest, adjacent to the frames where the queen was most actively laying. Not foundation, not new wax, drawn comb, previously used slightly darkened from prior brood cycles. Queens accept that comb for immediate laying. Foundation she may not lay in for 7 to 10 days while workers draw it out, and 7 to 10 days in a 5 to 6 week window is the difference between an aligned forager cohort and one that arrives a week after the flow peaks. The second adjustment was the removal of 1 to 2 frames of fully capped brood, not open larvae, specifically sealed pupae, from the brood nest, placed into a nucleus colony or a weaker production colony. This reduced the colony's nurse bee demand without disrupting the active brood cycle, and freed a portion of the nurse bee workforce to begin the physiological transition toward forager status earlier than the congested colony would have allowed. Together, these two adjustments did something that no amount of supering, no queen replacement, no supplemental feeding could accomplish. They reset the demographic trajectory of the colony at the precise biological moment when that trajectory was still shaping itself. The brood produced in the newly expanded nest over the following 6 weeks would emerge at the right time, complete the nurse phase at the right time, transition to forager status at the right time, peak at the right time. This is where the numbers are worth sitting with. The find worth sitting with. The Ohio and Indiana beekeepers, who applied this method consistently across multiple seasons and multiple apiaries, documented a surplus honey difference of 20 to 35% compared to colonies managed without that demographic alignment. Same apiary, same forage, same weather. That difference didn't come from the flow. It came from 6 weeks before the flow, from a single targeted intervention in the brood nest at the moment, when the colony's demographic curve was still malleable. In lean nectar years, that difference frequently separated a colony that produced extractable surplus from one that merely maintained its winter stores. In strong nectar years, the alignment allowed the colony to process an exceptional flow more efficiently because the forager workforce was at maximum size and minimum age precisely when nectar availability was at maximum volume. The colonies that outperformed were not extracting more honey per forager trip. They were fielding more foragers, younger foragers, bees that had just completed the nurse phase and were in the first and most productive weeks of their foraging life, rather than older bees whose efficiency was already declining. The beekeeper who understood this was not working harder during the flow. They were working earlier, 6 weeks earlier, at the precise moment when a targeted brood nest intervention could shift the entire demographic curve of the colony toward the window that mattered. If this kind of biology-first reasoning changes how you read a colony before the flow, subscribe. There's more historical method ahead. The kind that works without a catalogue order. Now, the method had limits that the beekeepers who used it understood precisely, and those limits are as instructive as the method itself. It was not applied to colonies showing any sign of elevated mite loads. A colony with compromised nurse bee physiology, the most common consequence of high varroa burden, will not respond to expanded laying space because the workforce that should fill that space with brood food is already impaired. The method requires healthy nurse bees. If they're physiologically depleted by mite-vectored viral damage, the drawn comb sits empty and the beekeeper has created disruption without benefit. It was not applied to colonies with queens showing irregular or spotty brood patterns. Expanded laying space does not correct a failing queen. It provides additional opportunity for a failing queen to express her failure across more frames. The correct response to a failing queen is replacement. Spatial management is for structurally constrained queens, not biologically failing ones. Knowing the difference requires looking at the brood pattern before reaching for the drawn comb, and it was not applied as a routine manipulation across all colonies, regardless of their individual brood nest condition. A beekeeper who opened a brood nest in early May and found the queen with ample open laying space across 8 full frames did not make the intervention. The colony didn't need it. The value of this method was diagnostic as much as mechanical. It was reserved for colonies where brood nest compression was actually occurring, where the evidence of spatial constraint was visible in the queen's laying pattern and in the architecture of the frames surrounding her. Applied indiscriminately, the method created unnecessary disruption. Applied diagnostically, at the right moment, in the right colonies, it reliably shifted the demographic curve in the direction the nectar flow rewarded. Timing precision within the window mattered, just as much as the mechanics themselves. Move too early, more than 7 weeks before the anticipated flow peak, and the colony's demographic recovery overshoots. The queen expands into the new comb, raises the brood, the bees emerge, complete the nurse phase, and reach forager status before the flow arrives. The forager cohort peaks pre-flow. They forage into limited early forage and age through their productive window before the primary nectar source opens. The colony enters the flow with an aging forager force rather than a fresh one. Move too late. Within 3 weeks of the flow peak, and there is insufficient time for the brood produced in the expanded nest to complete the full development cycle, emerge, complete the nurse phase, and reach forager status before the flow peaks. Those bees arrive as house bees during the flow and as foragers after it. The intervention produced no demographic benefit within the flow window. The practical window, documented in the Ohio records and confirmed across multiple seasons, was 5 to 6 weeks before the anticipated flow peak, close enough to the flow that the brood produced in the expanded nest would emerge and complete the nurse phase precisely as the primary nectar source was reaching its peak. Far enough in advance that the timing math could work. That window, in most of the American clover belt, still falls in early to mid-May. This method disappeared from published beekeeping literature gradually and without drama. By the 1930s, commercial queen rearing operations had become well established across the United States. The advice appearing in national beekeeping publications increasingly reflected the economic interests of those operations. A beekeeper who could optimize the demographic output of the queen she already had was a beekeeper who did not need to purchase a replacement queen. A beekeeper who understood brood nest architecture and its relationship to forager cohort timing was a beekeeper who did not need to buy package bees to rebuild a swarmed colony. The knowledge was not suppressed. It was crowded out by advice that was more commercially convenient. By the early 1940s, the standard guidance for improving honey production focused on queen replacement. Introduce a new queen in early spring for maximum laying vigor. Replace any queen over 1 year old. Maintain a continuous cycle of queen renewal through purchase stock. That advice is not entirely wrong. Young queens do lay vigorously, but it directed beekeeper attention toward the queen as a product to be purchased and replaced, rather than as a biological system to be understood and managed within the architecture of the hive. The beekeepers who had learned to read the brood nest as a demographic projection, and to align that projection with the nectar flow calendar, were doing something more precise and more durable than queen replacement. They were managing the timing of the colony's most productive biological output. That knowledge had no product attached to it, and so it quietly disappeared. The biology the 1923 beekeepers were working with has not changed. Queens still regulate their laying rate in response to available cell architecture. Brood nests still compress under the pressure of incoming spring forage. Worker bees still require 21 days from emergence to reach forager status. The demographic gap between a colony that enters the primary nectar flow with a fresh aligned forager cohort and one that enters it with a misaligned aging cohort still expresses itself in surplus honey weight at the end of the season. The intervention that corrects the architectural constraint, drawn open comb into the brood nest centre at the right biological moment, sealed brood removed to shift the nurse to forager ratio in the right direction, is still available to any beekeeper who understands what they're doing and why. It costs nothing to purchase. It requires no replacement stock, no commercial input, no catalogue order. It requires a bloom calendar, a diagnostic habit of reading the brood nest as a population projection rather than a health assessment, and the discipline to act 6 weeks before the problem becomes visible rather than 6 days after it becomes undeniable. The beekeeper who opens a hive in early May and sees a queen with ample open space, laying well, no compression from honey or pollen at the brood nest edges, that beekeeper closes the hive and moves on. The colony is aligned, nothing needs doing. The beekeeper who opens a hive in early May and sees a queen navigating through cells that have been reclaimed by incoming nectar, pollen packed against the brood nest edges, capped honey pressing down from above, that beekeeper knows what they're looking at. Not a failing colony. A colony whose demographic curve is drifting away from the flow window without intervention, and they know what to do about it, and when, and with what. The clover doesn't wait. The 21-day clock doesn't negotiate. The forager cohort that enters the flow is the one that was determined 6 weeks earlier by what happened or didn't happen inside the brood nest on a quiet morning in May. The beekeepers who outperformed their neighbours in the Ohio clover belt in 1923 were not smarter. They were not better equipped. They were not in better locations. They had asked a different question when they opened the hive. Not is this colony healthy, but will this colony's forager population peak when the clover peaks? That question, asked in early May, is still the question that determines what the honey house looks like in late June. Some of the most important beekeeping decisions you'll ever make happened 6 weeks before you realised they needed to be made. This was one of them. If this kind of historically grounded, biology-first approach changes how you read your colonies before the flow, subscribe. There is more historical method, more forgotten timing knowledge, and more biological precision ahead. The kind that works without a purchase order. And if you've had a season where a colony that looked strong in April left you standing in front of light supers in June, leave that below. That experience is more common than the literature admits, and the cause is almost never the weather.